We're going to continue with some more videos on psychological health. In the past, these were slides that I went over in class, but I think it's a great idea to have you watch this information before class, giving us more time to discuss what's been covered and address your questions. The caption for this reads, "No one shows up to the functional family conference," and it's true. Some of the traits that define a healthy mind, because it's important to look at what a healthy mind looks at before we look at one that's not feeling so healthy. Self-confidence, self-assertiveness, ego identity, optimism. This was in the first video, but what I've added is something that a colleague of mine insisted that I put into my talk. She teaches abnormal psych, and she insisted I add resilience. A stable disposition that allows you to bounce back. Resilience is a very important trait of a healthy mind. I believe I talked about this in the video, and it's something that rings really true for me. A healthy mind is one that is able to see problems as temporary and specific, not permanent and general. As we look inside the brain, the picture on the bottom is the anatomical brain. The one on the top, it contains the labels of the brain. You can also see that different portions of the brain are involved in problem solving, reasoning, speech. This becomes important, for example, when someone becomes unconscious or loses consciousness or has a stroke or some type of brain injury. Depending on what part of the brain is being affected, you can see all the different things that can result. Issues with problem solving, issues with vision, balance, coordination. All this is going on inside the brain. On the left, we have the names of some neurotransmitters, and on the right are some of the disorders that involve these neurotransmitters. Keep in mind that neurotransmitters are chemicals involved in transmitting impulses throughout the brain and the entire body. I think the ones that you may be most familiar with are serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. Yeah, maybe those. Let's watch a short video on how communication happens in the brain.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the neuron. This is a brain. Estimates vary, but right now the best guess seems to be that our brains contain around 85 billion neurons. The neuron is a nerve cell, and it's the primary functional unit of the nervous system. This is a generic image of a neuron. Neurons actually come in all shapes and sizes, but this is the prototypical version of a neuron that you'll often see in a textbook. The structures extending from the left side of the neuron that look a little bit like tree branches are called dendrites. Dendrites are the area where neurons receive most of their information. There are receptors on dendrites that are designed to pick up signals from other neurons that come in the form of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Those signals picked up by dendrites cause electrical changes in a neuron that are interpreted in an area called the soma, or the cell body. The soma contains the nucleus, which contains the DNA, or genetic material of the cell. The soma takes all the information from the dendrites and puts it together in an area called the axon hillock. If the signal coming from the dendrites is strong enough, then a signal is sent to the next part of the neuron, which is called the axon. At this point, the signal is called an action potential. The action potential travels down the axon, which is covered with myelin, an insulatory material that helps to prevent the signal from degrading. The last step for the action potential is the axon terminals, also known as synaptic buttons. When the signal reaches the axon terminals, it can cause the release of neurotransmitter. These purple structures represent the dendrites of another neuron. When a neurotransmitter is released from axon terminals, it interacts with receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron, and then the process repeats with the next neuron.
So when does a healthy mind become an unhealthy mind? Because you see, as I talked about in the first video, it is normal to experience variations in mindset. Your moods can change. But the question is, do these variations persist, or are they temporary? Are they mild, or are they intense? Do you look at them, as it says here, as temporary or specific? Are you able to see them as general and not permanent? So psychological disturbances become disordered when they are persistent, when they're recurrent, when they're unbearable and limiting your behavior, and they won't get better without treatment. What's a mental disorder? The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, defines it as, quote, clinically significant behavior or psychological syndrome or pattern that is associated with present distress, disability, or significantly increased risk of suffering, death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. Wow. But see, sometimes behaviors are within cultural boundaries and might not be causing distress or disability. My point being that sometimes being a little weird doesn't mean you're mentally ill. A mental illness is when distress and disability become so extreme that you are unable to maintain perspective anymore. And they can be due to all of these things, and probably some things we don't know about yet.